World War II is often remembered through the thunder of tanks, the roar of aircraft, and the clash of armies. Yet behind the front lines, another battlefield unfolded, one carved into the lives of children. For them, the war was not a distant story of generals and maps. It was the sound of sirens replacing lullabies, the sight of bombed-out homes replacing playgrounds, and the feeling of hunger gnawing through nights that seemed endless. Millions of boys and girls were forced to grow up too soon, robbed of safety and innocence. Their memories were written not in fairy tales or childhood games, but in the struggle to survive each day. Yes, this is their story. The children of war who endured the deadliest conflict in human history, not as soldiers, but as unwilling witnesses, victims, and sometimes resilient survivors. The world shifted suddenly in September 1939, when German forces invaded Poland. Childhood across Europe changed in a single moment. Families were torn apart almost overnight, and children found themselves thrust into a reality they could not understand. Many were forced to flee their homes with nothing but a blanket, a loaf of bread, or a favorite toy hastily stuffed into a small bag. Others stood frozen, wide-eyed, as columns of soldiers marched past their villages, their presence signaling the end of peace. For countless children, the war arrived without warning, announced only by the deafening scream of bombs or the sudden crack of gunfire. Innocence was stripped away in an instant, leaving behind confusion and fear. The ordinary rhythms of childhood, school, friends, games were replaced with questions of survival. Soon, air raids became a relentless rhythm of daily life. In cities like London, Hamburg, and Tokyo, children were jolted awake in the dead of night by the rising wail of sirens. Families rushed to underground shelters, clutching hastily packed bags and blankets. Some children carried small dolls or wooden toys, clinging to fragile comfort. Others pressed their faces into their mothers' coats, trying to block out the vibrations of explosions overhead. The shelters were both sanctuary and prison damp, crowded spaces filled with whispers, prayers, and the faint smell of fear. For children, every night brought the same question. When they emerged at dawn, would their homes still be standing, or would the familiar streets of their neighborhoods lie in ruins? Childhood dreams were replaced by nightly lessons in survival. Governments tried to protect children, but safety came at a painful cost. In Britain, mass evacuations relocated millions of young people from industrial cities to rural villages. Parents wept as they placed sons and daughters on crowded trains, uncertain when or if they would see them again. Each child carried a small suitcase, often packed with a change of clothes, a bit of food, and perhaps one treasured possession. For many, the countryside brought strange new homes, new rules, and long nights spent missing their families. Loneliness became their constant companion. Though the intention was safety, the price was separation, a wound that left scars on both children and parents. The evacuation showed how even acts meant to protect childhood could end up stealing pieces of it away. Elsewhere in Nazi-occupied Europe, the realities were even harsher. Jewish children in particular faced unimaginable horrors. Some were forced into overcrowded ghettos, where disease spread and food was scarce. Others were hidden in attics, barns, or cellars, living in silence for hours or even days at a time. Childhood games turned into deadly drills of survival, learning to remain still, to hold one's breath, or to vanish at the slightest sound. Their survival often depended on the bravery of strangers willing to risk everything. In such conditions, innocence vanished quickly. Children learned too early that trust was rare, that fear was constant, and that life itself could be stolen away in a moment. For them, childhood was not a stage of discovery, but a desperate test of endurance. In the Soviet Union, war brought devastation on a staggering scale. When German forces invaded in 1941, entire villages were wiped from the map. Families fled eastward, cramming into trains or trudging through endless fields with little more than what they could carry. Many children became orphans, wandering roadsides in search of food, begging for scraps from soldiers or kind strangers. Those who remained endured brutal winters with no coats, little firewood, and barely enough bread to survive. In besieged cities, hunger gnawed at their bodies, leaving them frail shadows of their former selves. Childhood became defined not by school or play, but by survival. Learning how to endure cold, how to find food, and how to live without parents. War turned children into survivors long before they were ready. Hunger became perhaps the most universal enemy of wartime childhood. In every theater of war, rationing meant that food was scarce. Children went to bed with empty stomachs, their growth stunted, their health weakened. In Leningrad, under siege for nearly 900 days, desperate families chewed wallpaper paste or boiled leather to quiet the pangs. In the Netherlands, during the hunger winter of 1944-45, children dug up tulip bulbs, cooking them into bitter meals that barely sustained life. Malnutrition left young bodies fragile, vulnerable to disease. For children, hunger was not an occasional discomfort. It was a constant shadow, shaping both their bodies and memories. The war starved not just nations but generations, leaving scars that would last long after the conflict ended. And yet, even in the bleakest moments, children discovered ways to hold on to fragments of joy. Among rubble and ruins, they improvised games from scraps of a broken world, rolling hoops made from old barrels, kicking rag-stuffed balls through streets reduced to dust, or playing hide-and-seek in the skeletal remains of buildings. These bursts of laughter were fleeting, but they mattered. They were acts of quiet defiance against a war determined to steal childhood itself. For a few brief moments, bombs and hunger could be forgotten, replaced by the simple thrill of play. These games were not mere diversions. They were lifelines, reminders that even in chaos, children remained children, clinging to the fragments of innocence, wherever they could find them. Education, too, became a battlefield. Many schools lay in ruins, their classrooms reduced to rubble. Teachers were drafted, and lessons were interrupted by the constant threat of air raids, yet learning did not stop at adapted. In basements and barns, children gathered by candlelight, their notebooks trembling as explosions echoed above. In occupied nations, secret classes defied bans, keeping alive languages, cultures, and histories the occupiers sought to erase. For children, education became more than lessons. It was resistance, hope, and a lifeline to a future beyond war. A schoolbook or slate became a fragile treasure, a symbol that the mind, unlike a city, could not be so easily conquered. Even in the darkest times, the pursuit of knowledge kept a spark of normalcy alive. But not every child clung to books. Germany. The Nazi regime demanded loyalty from its youngest citizens. The Hitler Youth drilled boys in military exercises, preparing them for war. While girls were taught to embrace roles as future mothers of the Reich, for some children, these organizations offered structure, meals, and a sense of belonging. But the cost was individuality, replaced with obedience and ideology. As the conflict deepened, the demands grew harsher. Teenage boys were pulled from classrooms and handed rifles, fighting in the final desperate battles of the Reich. Childhood was stripped away and replaced with uniforms, slogans, and orders shouted by commanders. For German children, growing up meant not just surviving war but serving it, their innocence reshaped into instruments of the state. Beyond Germany's borders, under Nazi occupation, children faced a different reality. France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, daily life unfolded beneath the heavy boots of soldiers. Schoolyards echoed with whispers of resistance. And sometimes even children played small but vital roles, carrying secret notes tucked inside school bags, or keeping lookout as couriers hurried through alleyways. The line between innocence and resistance blurred quickly. For every act of courage, however, there was a constant fear of betrayal. German patrols roamed the streets, and collaborators lived among neighbors. One wrong step, one overheard word, could mean imprisonment or worse. Children grew up in a world where trust was fragile and danger lurked in every corner. Their childhood games were replaced by survival instincts sharpened far earlier than nature intended. Across the English Channel, children lived under constant threat of German bombs. In London, the Blitz rained fire from the skies, reducing neighborhoods to ash and rubble. For many young Londoners, nights were spent in underground stations, curled up on hard concrete platforms, with blankets and gas masks close at hand.
Ow.
The rumble of trains was replaced by the drone of enemy aircraft, followed by the deafening crash of bombs. Some children sketched the chaos in notebooks, their drawings a haunting record of destruction. Yet resilience grew in the cracks. Morning after raids, children walked past smoldering ruins on their way to school, stepping carefully around craters and shattered glass. For them, normal life persisted in fragments. A school lesson here, a shared laugh, their survival stitched together by stubborn determination. In the countryside, evacuees tried to adjust to new lives among strangers. Some were welcomed warmly, discovering fresh air, open fields, and generous foster families. Others, however, faced suspicion, neglect, or even abuse, seen as burdens rather than guests. Siblings were often separated, their bonds tested by distance and silence. Letters home became lifelines, but replies were slow, sometimes never arriving. For children, the countryside was both haven and prison, safe from bombs but heavy with loneliness. While they learned to milk cows, harvest crops, or attend village schools, their thoughts often drifted back to mothers and fathers left behind in cities under attack. Childhood became a story written between two worlds, one of temporary refuge and another of constant longing for home. In Eastern Europe, war carved deep scars into young lives. Children in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Balkans saw entire towns burned to the ground. Many witnessed atrocities firsthand, neighbors executed, families deported, homes looted. In rural areas, children were sometimes pulled into partisan struggles, serving as messengers or guides in forests and mountains. But with courage came danger. German reprisals were brutal, often targeting entire villages if partisans struck nearby. For children, the line between childhood and adulthood disappeared almost overnight. They learned to hide, to run, and sometimes even to fight. Fear became their companion, yet so did resilience. Amid violence and loss, children held fast to threads of hope, waiting for the day when silence would finally replace the sound of gunfire. Meanwhile, across the oceans in Japan, children faced a different kind of war. At first, propaganda filled classrooms, teaching loyalty to the emperor and glorifying sacrifice. Boys trained with bamboo spears, preparing for an invasion that never came. Girls were taught discipline and duty, their futures framed as service to family and nation. But as the war turned against Japan, reality intruded harshly. Cities were firebombed into infernos, leaving children wandering through charred streets in search of parents or siblings. Schools became barracks or hospitals, their lessons replaced by the struggle to survive day to day. The youngest became silent witnesses to devastation on a scale unimaginable, their childhoods marked not by play, but by the red glow of burning skies above their homes. The Pacific Islands, too, bore witness to children caught between empires. On places like Guam, the Philippines, and New Guinea, families were displaced as battles turned their villages into front lines. Children hid in jungles, learning to move silently among trees to escape notice from soldiers. Hunger followed them, as fields were abandoned and food supplies stolen or destroyed. Yet even here, resilience shone. Some children carried messages for resistance fighters, while others helped their families survive by fishing, foraging, or scavenging abandoned supplies. Still, the war's cruelty was ever present. Air raids, naval bombardments, and battles between great powers left little room for innocence. These island children grew up knowing the roar of planes, the crash of artillery, and the endless search for safety in lands once peaceful. Back in Europe, one of the darkest chapters unfolded in the concentration camps. Children arriving at places like Auschwitz or Treblinka were often separated from parents within minutes, many sent directly to their deaths. Those who survived the initial selections faced starvation, disease, and forced labor. Childhood was erased behind barbed wire, replaced by uniforms of striped rags and numbers tattooed on arms. Yet even here, fragments of humanity remained. Older children sometimes shared crusts of bread with the younger ones. In rare moments, songs were whispered, stories told, memories clung to. These small acts of kindness defied the machinery of death. For those who endured, survival came not only through resilience of body, but through stubborn clinging to the idea of life beyond the fences. As the war dragged on, displacement became a defining feature of childhood. Refugee camps swelled across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Children grew up in tents, barracks, or makeshift shelters, surrounded by strangers who became temporary families. Days blurred into each other, queues for food, endless waiting, the uncertainty of tomorrow. Education was patchy at best, often delivered by volunteers or surviving teachers. Yet in these camps, bonds formed. Games emerged among rows of tents, laughter echoing briefly against the backdrop of loss. For some, these camps were temporary. For others, they stretched into years, shaping entire childhoods. The camp became both prison and sanctuary, a place where the absence of home was felt most deeply, and where the future remained uncertain, suspended in limbo. Letters and photographs became lifelines during these years. For children separated from fathers at the front, or mothers in occupied zones, a scrap of handwriting or a faded picture was priceless. Families clung to correspondence, reading words over and over until the paper wore thin. For children too young to read, adults would whisper the letters aloud, turning ink into lullabies of hope. Yet silence was often louder than words. Many waited for letters that never came, their absence speaking of death, imprisonment, or journeys from which loved ones would not return. Childhood became intertwined with waiting, waiting for news, waiting for peace, waiting for the family to be whole again. In this waiting, children learned the hardest lesson. Sometimes hope was all they had. Toward the end of the war, violence grew even more desperate. As Germany crumbled, children were forced into militias, fighting hopeless battles in the ruins of cities like Berlin. In Japan, young boys and girls braced for invasion, trained to sacrifice themselves if the enemy landed. Across Eastern Europe, children fled, advancing armies, trekking miles on foot through mud and snow. Liberation brought joy, but also confusion. For many, parents were gone, homes destroyed, and the world unrecognizable. Childhoods stolen by war could not simply be restored. Yet within that loss, seeds of resilience remained.
Ow.
These young survivors carried forward not just scars, but also strength. Their stories became the quiet testimony of a generation shaped by shadows, yet still capable of rebuilding life after unimaginable darkness. Liberation came unevenly, and for many children, it was not a single moment of joy, but a slow awakening. In France and the Netherlands, cheers erupted as Allied tanks rolled through streets. Children climbing onto vehicles, showering soldiers with flowers, yet for those who had endured occupation, trust was fragile. Neighbors accused of collaboration were punished in public squares, scenes both confusing and frightening for young eyes. In Eastern Europe, liberation often meant one occupier replaced by another as Soviet troops marched in. For Jewish children, freedom sometimes revealed devastating truths: entire families gone, homes stolen, communities erased. Liberation brought sunlight after years of shadow, but it also illuminated the depth of loss. For children, joy and grief arrived hand in hand, reshaping what freedom truly meant. The war's end did not mean an end to suffering. Millions of children were displaced, wandering through ruined landscapes with no clear home to return to. Some were placed in orphanages, where rows of iron beds filled vast halls with silence and sobs. Others were adopted, sometimes by strangers from faraway countries, their identities reshaped, along with their futures. For those reunited with surviving parents, the joy was real, but often complicated relationships strained by years of absence and trauma. Childhood could not be rewound. For many, the war had carved gaps too deep to fill, shaping lives long after the guns fell silent. Peace had arrived, but for children, healing was only beginning, and the journey back to normalcy stretched across lifetimes. Education after the war became both a necessity and symbol. Across bombed-out Europe and Asia, temporary schools were set up in tents, churches, or even open fields. Children sat on wooden crates, using scraps of paper to practice lessons. Teachers spoke not only of mathematics or literature, but of rebuilding, of peace, of futures that must not repeat the past. For many children, school was their first step back toward normalcy, a space where laughter could cautiously return. Yet the war had left marks some could not focus, haunted by nightmares, while others carried physical wounds that made learning difficult. Still, education was embraced as a tool of recovery, proof that even after so much destruction, knowledge could light a path forward for a broken generation. Stories of survival soon began to surface, told by children who had lived through horrors beyond imagination. Some recounted hiding in forests for years, surviving on roots and berries. Others remembered train rides packed with refugees, journeys stretching into endless nights. In Japan, children described the sky lit with firebombs, cities consumed in minutes. In Poland, memories of ghettos and camps spilled forth haunting voices too young to carry such weight. Each story was different, yet all shared a common truth. Childhood had been stolen, reshaped by war, into something unrecognizable. These testimonies became living archives, carried forward by those who refused to let silence bury their past. For the world, they were warnings. For the children, they were the only way to reclaim their stolen years. Psychologists and doctors began to study what the war had done to young minds. Terms like war trauma and childhood stress emerged, though their full meaning would take decades to understand. Children who had lost years to fear, hunger, and violence often struggled to adapt to peace. Some were withdrawn, others aggressive, unable to trust easily. Nightmares persisted, and the sound of sudden sirens or loud bangs triggered panic. Yet within this pain, resilience also revealed itself. Many survivors grew into adults, determined to build a better world, their suffering transformed into drive. For others, the scars never healed fully, shaping families and communities for generations. The war proved that children, though resilient, carried burdens that echoed long past the final gunshots. In the post-war years, international organizations stepped in to care for the youngest victims. UNIF was founded in 1946, its first mission to deliver milk, medicine, and clothing to starving children across Europe and Asia. Red Cross workers reopened orphanages, while relief agencies distributed food and blankets to refugee camps. These efforts were not just about survival, but about restoring dignity to children robbed of it by war. Posters and campaigns showed wide-eyed children holding bowls of soup, symbols of both suffering and hope. Aid workers described the joy of handing out crayons or storybooks to children who had known nothing but rubble and fear. These simple gifts, food, warmth, color, became the first steps in helping a generation believe that life could be kind again. Slowly, cultures of memory began to form. Museums, memorials, and books carried the voices of wartime children into the public conscience. Anne Frank's diary, written from a hidden annex in Amsterdam, gave the world an unfiltered glimpse into a girl's stolen adolescence. Other memoirs followed some decades later, as survivors found the strength to write. Their words became not only testimonies of pain, but acts of resistance against forgetting. For children of war, storytelling was survival extended into adulthood, ensuring that what they endured would not vanish into silence. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of history, reminding the world that behind every battlefront and every statistic, there were young lives interrupted, dreams deferred, and innocence shattered. The shadow of World War II lingered long after the peace treaties. Many children grew up to become leaders, artists, or teachers who carried the weight of their experiences into their work. Their art reflected loss, their politics often centered on peace, their teaching grounded in the importance of empathy. But others carried darker legacies and trauma passed down to their own children. The war's impact was generational. Its echoes heard in households decades later. Childhood's loss could not be returned, but the lessons born from suffering reshaped entire societies. The children of war became the adults who built the post-war world, their resilience woven into the foundations of peace, but their scars never fully hidden beneath its surface. Today, when we remember World War II, the images often focus on soldiers, battles, and leaders. Yet behind those headlines lived millions of children whose struggles were no less heroic. They did not carry rifles, but they carried hunger, loss, and fear. They endured nights in bomb shelters, days in refugee camps, and years without parents. Their courage was quieter, their battles fought not in trenches but in classrooms, basements, and ruins. To remember the war without them is to miss its most human cost. The children of war remind us that innocence is fragile, and that the toll of conflict is measured not only in territory lost or gained, but in childhood stolen forever. As the decades pass, fewer of these children remain to tell their stories. Yet their voices echo across time, urging us to see war not through maps or statistics, but through the eyes of those who lost the most. The sirens, the hunger, the longing for parents who never returned, these memories live on as warnings. They remind us that war reshapes generations, leaving scars long after treaties are signed. To honor the children of World War II is to carry forward their legacy of resilience and to ensure that their suffering is never forgotten. Their shadows stretch across history, but so too does their strength, a reminder of humanity's endurance even in its darkest hours.